They were really one of the first 2 or 3 vendors that came out with this idea to do scale out object storage, but I think they were ahead of the pack in thinking, let's really decouple from the platform.
Hello and welcome to episode 64 of Great Things with Great Tech, the podcast highlighting companies doing great things with great technology. My name's Anthony Spiteri, and in this episode, we're talking to a company dealing in petabyte scale software-defined storage, revolutionizing the way organizations store and manage their data, a company transforming data management and infrastructure across industries while focusing on combating the growing threat of ransomware. That company is Scality, and I'm speaking to Paul Speciale, CMO at Scality. Welcome to the show, Paul.
Thanks, Anthony. It's a pleasure to be here.
Excellent. So just before we go back to a topic that I love talking about, which is software-defined storage, just as a reminder, if you love great things with great tech and would like to be on future episodes, you can click on the link on the show notes or go to GTwGT.com and register your interest. Just as a reminder, all episodes of GTwGT are available on all good podcasting platforms, Google, Apple, Spotify, all hosted and distributed by Spotify Podcasts. And just as a reminder, go to YouTube, go to @GTwGT podcast, hit that like and subscribe button, and you will get all future episodes, as well as being able to see all previous 63 episodes. With that, Paul, welcome to the show. And I guess let's start with giving a bit about your background,
Sure.
and the fact that you've been at Scality for, 2/3 of its life, basically. Let's
right.
start with you, and then we'll get into the history of Scality.
Sure. So to kind of boil my career down, I've been in the tech industry now for almost 30 years, I'm afraid to say. I kind of focused the original 10 years on data management database companies, but the last 20 I've been really focused on data storage, a little bit of cloud mixed in as well. And my roles have started as a developer. So I actually was a C++ developer, then I became a product manager. I was the chief product officer here, and now I'm the chief marketing officer. So I've kind of run the gamut.
Wow. Cool.
But you end up realizing it's all very interconnected anyway. So each one built on the previous.
Yeah, excellent. And the fact that you're a coder by trade is also interesting as well, right? So that points to some great evolution. But I think, being a coder, product manager, and now, CMO points to, just intrinsic, value of all that knowledge that you've built up over your 30-year career. So
it always helps.
Yeah, there you go. Hey, so with Scality, a company started, born out of Paris, France in 2009. But maybe just give a bit of a background as to the founding of the company itself and why the company was founded back by, I think it was four co-founders back in 2009.
Yeah, it's actually 5 founders. They were all based in Paris, France. And it turns out that they were all already affiliated through a previous company. They were working on email security software, especially for service providers. So they really got to know the service provider space very well. They started working with the big ones, like Orange in France and Telenet in Belgium and Comcast in the US. It was actually those companies that started saying to them, hey, look, we've got a big data storage problem. And that's kind of the spark that started them thinking about, could we do something that's innovative in software-defined storage? So indeed, it started in Paris, France, and it's become kind of a mini global after that.
Yeah, I mean, you're now kind of co-headquartered out of the US and France, so it's quite interesting in that sense. The company itself started in a period of time where software-defined storage and SDS was all the rage. So what was the original? And you said you had a really, really good, solid foundation in the service provider space. I'm actually interested. So what was the nature of the software before that in terms of what they were working on?
Well, they were working on anti-spam solutions. So they really understood kind of this whole big, scalability problem in terms of webmail scale problems. They understood things like distributed systems. That was a lot of core technology. If you build a system like this, you have to bring together a lot of domains, right? It's data storage, it's networking, it's RESTful protocols. There's so much of it that comes together. So they were able to borrow that expertise. But of course, the team broadened out and became more experts in data storage. The core idea really was to provide scalable petabyte scale storage and to do it on open systems, on commodity platforms. Even up until that time, you had storage systems that were just proprietary. They were custom hardware, software. And so the innovation was to decouple that, to really do this in software and give the customer freedom of choice on the platform.
Yeah, I think that's a good key of what software-defined storage was trying to achieve back in the day. I mean, we are talking a while ago now, and we'll talk a little bit about where the industry is today, in regards to SDS. But back then, I would have guessed that if I think back to that time frame, we had Nutanix starting to sort of come out of its weeds. We were having even before that, though, I think well, actually after that, VMware were doing their own sort of thing with vSAN, but that was more 2012-13 period. But we had an inkling something was happening. But so from my workings out, Scality was almost one of the first to really come out and say, we're going to be software defined. We're going to truly decouple our software from our hardware. Am I kind of right in saying that, given the timeline that I'm working out?
You're absolutely right. They were really one of the first 2 or 3 vendors that came out with this idea to do scale out object storage. But I think they were ahead of the pack in thinking, let's really decouple from the platform. They went pretty far. This is in 2010 before I joined. They were actually delivering software for Linux packages. So the customer could actually say, I'm running CentOS, I'm running Red Hat, I'm running some other distro. They could pick their distro and pick their hardware. So they really were software defined, right? You had other vendors. In fact, I was with one of them. They were called Amplidata, where we said it's software, but it's targeted at a certain fixed hardware, right? So they really pushed the envelope in terms of giving that customer the freedom of choice. You're right. It's now 13 years later than that, and we still look at why people buy. And I'll tell you, if you look at the top 2 or 3 reasons, people still say, I don't want to be vendor locked. I just don't want to be vendor locked, right? I want to have my choice to choose my platform today and even in the future when I grow. And we've had that happen a few times where people jumped to a different vendor as they scaled the system.
Yeah, if I think back to those days when I was deep in the weeds of architecting hosting platforms, I remember the monolithic storage systems that we had to deal with and the problems that arose with it. It was always problematic. So we were always looking for this new what's next type of solution, and to its end, back end scalability and ease of use was huge, right? And then it was even better if you could take a sunk cost of a storage system that you had done and repurpose it in some way. And I think that's a big benefit of being hardware agnostic and software defined, is you give your customers freedom of choice to be able to not only choose the hardware moving forward as they design new platforms, but maybe be able to realize investments in older hardware and add that and keep that going a little bit longer. Is that what you see with Scality as well in terms of your customer base?
Yeah, we do. In fact, I have an interesting anecdote. Since I was with Amplidata and they were later acquired, we went back to one of the customers I had in Japan who had the old hardware and said, can the Scality Ring run on these old servers? And the answer was yes. So it really provided kind of investment protection. But the other thing you see with customers is that they want to know that they can make choices at any point. For example, a lot of vendors force the obsolescence of the hardware platform, right? They'll say in 3 years or 5 years, move to our new model, or we're going to start charging you some higher support fees. That goes away, right? Because we don't control the hardware. So they have full control. Do they want to run it for 5, 6, 7 years? And then you're organically growing as well, right? There's no disruption as you pick the next generation of servers that you want to run on. So it's organic growth, not only across your choice, but even across different generations of servers.
Yeah, I get that. And I think one of the challenges in the early days, going back, and again, I've maybe repressed a few of these memories as well, because that's what we do, right? Was just the promise of scalability was always there, but the reality of the hardware that was at the time, specifically the disks, right? And how you dealt with the physics of still SSD not being, front and center, NVMe not really being even possible to be bought, right? So in those early days, how did Scality deal with that? There's obviously got to be some smarts in the software that get around the inherent problem of physics.
Yeah, there's been some real changes. You're reminding me of the day that I started, working on this problem in 2010. We were dealing with 10 and 20 gigabyte drives. Right. So the design point, even for the Scality Ring at the time, was to think about scaling to tens of thousands of nodes, right? Because to make multiple petabytes out of these small boxes, you had to start thinking about those numbers, right? Today, it's an entirely different world, right? You can get a petabyte in a single chassis. So, running something on 2 or 3 servers might make perfect sense for some customers, but you really need to design things that are innately scalable, don't have a single point of failure, right? And that's not only for scale, but it's for high availability.
Yeah.
And then you need to put these wrappers on it to make it, like you said, easy to manage, right? Because ultimately you're going to have, people that need to run storage systems, but also need to know how to manage it with their networks and their applications. So to put that thinking on, an operational scale was really the thing that they had to come up with.
Yeah, and scalability and resiliency together, typically in the early days didn't go hand in hand. You almost had to have one or the other from memory, right? And a lot of hardware vendors, specifically, I think the ones that went for trying to go to a specific appliance and tying everything in together, really struggled to achieve that perfect sort of triangle of performance, scalability, and reliability. So how did Scality get over that hurdle?
Well, I don't know if you remember, but back in this 2009, 2010 timeframe, there was also the emergence of what we now think is common, which is erasure coding.
Yes.
Right. We all started seeing that there was the end of the reliability of RAID 5, RAID 6 for large scale systems, right? It works perfectly well when you have a few dozen drives. But now think about a system that has thousands of drives, right? Things are going to fail all the time.
Yep.
And you don't want to be constantly in this degraded mode rebuilding things. So we started pioneering the idea of doing resiliency over these different protocols, right? Using erasure codes, variable parity schemes, and even doing geographic spreading of that data so that you could have site failure tolerance, right? So those were kind of the innovations that were intrinsic into the system from the beginning. The ability to have thousands of nodes participating with thousands of drives, and to do kind of this geo-spread erasure coding so that things can fail. You just expect them to fail. That's okay. If they fail, you have enough redundancy in the system. And by the way, we can self-heal. So if a drive fails, we'll just rebuild the missing data to another drive in the cluster.
Yeah, that's correct, because I think even systems that were based, a lot of storage systems were based on ZFS and all that sort of technology as well. But the painfulness of actually a single drive failure and that on a rebuild and a Z pull and all that kind of stuff was painful, like you said. So we needed a better way to be able to tolerate that at scale, because you're right. Like I remember specifically systems, degrading for months while a rebuild was happening, and it was just untenable. But you had to deal with it at the time. So I think that's where a lot of the software-defined object storage, erasure coding came into play, and they realized that it was a better way.
There was a better way. You ended up realizing you just expect failures to happen, right? It's kind of the hyperscaler model. There's always going to be component failures, and it's a normal mode of operation. By the way, it shouldn't even be an emergency. You don't need an admin standing by to replace a drive if something happens, right? You just let it happen and you route around it.
That's it. So in terms of products, so obviously you've got the Scality RING, and then we'll talk about ARTESCA a little bit later on. So Ring has Ring been there from the start as the product name?
It has. So Ring, it's the name comes from the underlying topology. There was actually a distributed peer-to-peer protocol called Cord that MIT published in the 2008, something like that timeframe. That describes a peer-to-peer ring technology with a ring circular key space. So that's the origin of the name. It's always been the product name. The product actually launched in 2010, and it's been our flagship product since. It started, I should say, as a pure object store, but at some point we may want to talk that we also introduced a distributed file system right into the object store. So it's today presented as both file and object storage.
Yeah, okay. And obviously offering the ability to, back in those days, I think, would it be fair to say the target was, VMware virtualization platforms back then? Or even back then, we were looking at more larger sets of data to store? Because even the concept of big data and, the growth of data itself is relatively new in terms of the scale of it. And I think back then, we were just really interested in how much performance and scalability could we get into our virtual platform with our storage?
Yeah, I would say that VMware was always a factor, right? There was always this thinking that virtual machines needed data storage. But honestly, the use cases that drove object storage more at the beginning, you started thinking about images and videos, right? I mentioned email. That was kind of one specific use case that the service providers wanted to do because they were still hosting their own email services for their consumers. But then you had photo sharing services, video sharing services, backup for consumers. That's what the service providers wanted to build, and they didn't want to build it on EMC symmetrics, right? They wanted to build it on something that was agile, designed for billions of objects. Just a sense of scale. Today, we have one service provider that has 220 billion unique objects in one ring, right? That's an entirely different level of scale than you're going to get from previous technology. So the use cases that drove it were these kind of rich media things, because that's where you start getting petabytes, right? And then you could start thinking about, service providers that certainly want to host backup as a service or, storage as a service offerings. That's really where the roots of this were.
No, that's a good way to approach it, right? So yeah, because if you thought back in those, say 2010 to 2015 days, the size of a virtual machine was maybe, it got up to 100 gigs maybe, you know what I mean?
Right.
So the storage in those machines wasn't traumatic, right? So
exactly.
you guys targeting those higher, targets of storage, I think from what I'm sort of putting together, has given you the ability to get ahead of the game in terms of the architecture, the design, the actual performance aspect of it.
Yeah, you remember also at this time, we already had a generation of scale-out NAS devices, and they were focused on things like media and entertainment storage and, internal editing, transcoding type use cases, right? But that's a certain level of internal scale. As soon as you put it on the cloud, you start realizing that, now you've got 100,000 users and you've got, like I said, a few billion objects. It's a different level of scale. And that's what we always started focusing on, right?
Yeah.
So the sweet spot for Ring really became people that had a petabyte or more, but they were quickly thinking about getting to tens of petabytes. That's the level of scale where this system really made sense and still does today. And now the use cases have just expanded, right? Because at the time we weren't thinking medical imaging, we weren't thinking of government surveillance, right? There's just so much more today that makes sense at this very large scale.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just going back to the whole concept of software-defined storage, or SDS, it was obviously a buzzword for a number of years there, right? And then again, VMware jumped on it, Nutanix jumped on it. Everyone was, if I think about it today, in the last sort of 4 years, how would I parallel it? It's like, okay, there was crypto. We've got AI happening at the moment. There's always these buzzes that occur in tech, right? And SDS was definitely one of those. So how do you see...
SDS was one.
Yeah, how do you see the evolution of that from where it was back then to where it is today, settled, and fairly mature in terms of its market, where people don't even really talk about it as a leading, sort of descriptor of what they're doing, but it's still very important.
Yeah, let me, my way of categorizing it is the following, right? We had block, file, and object SDS, software-defined storage, right? We were playing in this arena of object, software-defined storage. I'll give you one other thing, though, that really happened to kind of move this into an accelerated form. At the time that the Ring launched, the acceptance of the Amazon S3 protocol as the de facto standard was not clear.
Yeah.
So many of us, including Scality, many vendors, were looking at what's the default protocol for doing object storage, right? And we thought about, you remember the old Swift protocol?
Yep.
EMC had Centera, they had their own API. You had SNIA, the storage networking consortium, that came up with their own called CDMI. Around 2013-14, you start realizing that people are embracing S3, and moreover, the application vendors started using it to interface with object storage, right?
Yeah.
So you started seeing this emergence of people saying, aha, S3 is here to stay. Amazon's S3 started getting really big. And I'll tell you what, that was really a spark to make object SDS really accelerate. Now, applications were written to it, and ISVs, independent software vendors, embraced it.
Yeah, and I think, Swift Price had forgotten about that. But I remember when back in the day when I launched our first object storage platform, which wasn't that great. It was based on Ceph, but we had to offer both protocols. It was Swift and or S3. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
So, and that today is gone the way of the dodo. So
yeah. And we've supported them all, and as well as Azure Blob. So there's been so many choices in all this, but this one's here to stay. And with vendors like Veeam now really fully embracing it, it makes complete sense.
Absolutely. It's become the future. We talk about that a lot actually now in terms of what's the future of object storage. It's not just talking about cloud or, a way to put your archival storage. It's primary use cases, which I've argued as well. When I've said that, in my head, I've been thinking, well, it's actually been primary use case for the longest time as well, because you think about vSAN, Nutanix, there was a few others out there that were there. It was all based on object storage under the surface, right? And it still kind of is. So it's always been there. Just talk a little bit more about the Scality Ring and its capabilities, and then we'll move on to ARTESCA.
Yeah, no problem. So again, the Ring was designed to be this very scalable, but also very flexible SDS solution for object storage, right? These early adopters in the service provider space certainly embraced it to build their cloud services, but the company realized that to really penetrate the market in a bigger way, we had to go after the enterprise. So there was always going to be this enterprise space that was going to build a private cloud and have their own internal workloads. But what's the problem, right? At the time, they were still very much stuck with older legacy applications that were based on file protocols. So we made this rather big decision to actually integrate a file system into the object store. And that was a unique decision. The other vendors in the space actually decided to plug in kind of a gateway technology.
Yes.
So you have NFS or SMB speaking to the object store, right? But now you've got POSIX built into the object store kernel, so you can present NFS, SMB, or S3 on an equal footing. They can all scale out in capacity and in performance. And that really got things rolling, right? So now you're in the enterprise, you can start talking to people about, legacy backup on SMB, right? All the vendors supported that. And it creates this bridge to object storage. So now they're comfortable with the solution, they see the scale, and they start onboarding other apps, right? So that was really the promise of it. So today the Ring is scale out file and object storage. It's super rich in the S3 API. It actually emulates Amazon in its identity management model.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So there's a whole idea of IAM. If you know how to administer users and accounts and groups and roles and policies in Amazon, it's exactly the way it looks in Ring. Okay, so this whole security, authentication, access control stuff looks identical.
Yeah.
From a file system perspective, it's what you mount NFS, you mount SMB, exactly the same. Okay, the system is very, very feature rich. We're investing a lot in both sides. So today it can do, distributed, replicated deployments. It can start small, it can grow online. It does online growth. It does online updates. The system is just hugely reliable, and now it has this 13-year track record of running at massive scale, 100 petabyte plus in a single system.
Yeah, because you're up to version 9 from memory, aren't you?
We are at version 9. We introduced that at the end of last year. We do kind of this tech train model, so it'll conclude with a long-term support version this year, and then it's on to Ring 10. So
yeah,
we have a roadmap going forward to 2030.
That's a great,
for Ring.
Oh, it's amazing. It's a great cadence as well in terms of if you think about from 2009, first release in 2010. So 9 major versions, all probably with significant feature upgrades over 13 years. That's pretty impressive. So in version 9, what would you say are the biggest new features in version 9?
Well, we've been super focused on this whole ransomware problem. So everything from object storage, immutability at the API layer, things like S3 object locking, that's been really, really important for, the backup use case. Backup is more and more sensitive to ransomware. We've done multi-target replication so that people can have a home system and one or more remote disaster recovery sites. That's been a really high demand. The ability to make operations easier, simplified consoles, to manage distributed systems in an easier way from a single console. And now you have this concept of the edge starting to roll in. So people want to have ARTESCA on the edge, Ring in the center. How do I manage that from a single console? Those are kind of the focus areas.
So actually, one of the questions I was going to ask is, what's the link between Ring and ARTESCA?
Yeah. So the real common thread is that they're both S3 API products, right? But what we realized with Ring is that it's this very high-end flexible product. What we needed was something that was sort of very friendly for the mid-range, very simple, right? And one of the ways to simplify it is to do a little bit less. And one of the big things we chose to do less was not do a file system, right? That ends up putting a lot of extra work, a lot of extra baggage to administer the product. So it's pure object storage. We did start architecting parts of Ring in containers and deploying on Kubernetes, but ARTESCA takes that a step further. So ARTESCA is actually completely cloud native. It's fully microservices based. It deploys on Kubernetes, so it's the future in terms of the architecture. Eventually, that can become more and more of the architecture of Ring, at least at the top end, right? They sort of differ at the storage layer. But that's the main shared technology is really S3. We were one of the first to actually put an S3 open source server, into the open source domain. Both of our systems use the same tech in terms of their S3 API capabilities, and we leverage both in both systems.
Yeah. So is ARTESCA only deployable in a containerized environment, or is it other options for it?
No, so it's software only today. We're also starting to roll it out as an OVA for VMware.
Okay.
Okay, so there's two choices, and a little bit of a hint is there may be more options coming in the next few weeks.
Oh, excellent, good stuff. Yeah, no, I was wondering what the differences are, because obviously it's object storage throughout, but then
Right.
yeah, you've just effectively taken a little bit of the overhead of well, not overhead, maybe even complexity is not the right word, but you've just basically simplified the ring to broaden the appeal out to a bigger mind share, right?
Yeah, the other fundamental difference, of course, is that you've got this distributed peer-to-peer system under Ring, so it starts on a cluster, right? It's
Yeah.
never going to run on one host or one server. ARTESCA can, right? And
Okay.
the way it
Big,
does
yeah.
it has a little bit of a different data durability model. It can do local data protection and distributed data protection, so it understands that it might be deployed as a singleton, right?
Yeah.
And it needs to be reliable in its own sense, but then it can grow and change its durability scheme to distributed.
Yeah, I understand that. So, and that was, I mean, I read somewhere that it was co-designed with HP, but I know that's not directly sort of accurate. But just talk a little bit about the partnership with Hewlett Packard there in terms of how that came to be.
Yeah, with HPE, we've been, engaged with them in, increasing ways since about 2014. That was the time at which we started the partnership. They actually we did an agreement for them to resell Ring. So today, if you buy object storage from HPE, it's Scality RING. They did an investment in the company through their Pathfinder Ventures in 2016.
Cool.
And we continued to engage, right? So there was a time in about 2019 where they said they would like an object store that runs on an all-flash version of the HPE Apollo. That was really the collaboration. We built the software, they provided the first platform, and they were sort of our inaugural launch partner, I would say, for ARTESCA. So we offered it on not only Apollo, the big one and the small one, but also on the DL servers, all flash and hybrid models. Okay, so they saw it as a different offering that they could offer as a lightweight object store for some of these mid-market use cases.
Yeah, very good. Just as a bit of a segue there in terms of just the general state of storage, the paradigm of where we were 10 years ago versus today, with NVMe being where it is, and even more advanced sort of storages that are out there. How has that helped Scality, in terms of achieve what it's wanted to achieve: reliability, scalability, and ease of use?
Yeah, so Flash has been a very constant thing for us in one way, right? Even since the very beginning, Ring has always used a small component of Flash for metadata storage, right? Whether it's POSIX metadata or S3 metadata. We use it for accelerating, the metadata store and doing lookup operations. We went a little further and we started to use Flash very aggressively for internal indexes. So we containerize the data on disk. We need an index that helps us locate where the files are. All of that's in Flash, right? So we do everything we can to shield the spinning disks from IOs until we actually need the data. So in fact, we can deploy Ring in a very high performance way. If you need a lot of throughput, we'll still, in all likelihood, recommend spinning disk, right? So it's the small amount, let's say 1 or 2% of the overall capacity on Flash, the rest on spinning disk. But now you have this ability to go further with Flash. Let's say you have an all-flash server. What can we do? We can make small IOs quicker. We can make random IOs quicker. And that started becoming important when we started seeing workloads like in analytics. More and more things like Splunk came at us, and Apache Spark, right? Now you're not always going to have multi-megabyte video data. You're going to have small log files. You're going to have event streams. So that's where all flash comes in, and both Ring and ARTESCA can take advantage of it. But again, we're not saying that HDD is gone, right? It still works really well for the workloads where you need aggregate throughput or streaming sequential IO.
Absolutely, yeah, that's correct. And I think you've pointed to a part of the industry now. It's hugely growing in importance with regards to log analytics. That's all part of the ransomware conversation, and we're going to have a bit of a longer conversation shortly on that.
Right.
So to be able to leverage the technology of the disks as it moves through, Flash and NVMe for those smaller billions of object sort of use cases, that's kind of setting
Yeah.
yourselves up for a really good spot, like you say, into 2030, which isn't too far away. Scarily
It's
enough.
not
How
far
is it?
away. And I should say the ARTESCA durability model, this idea that you do local and distributed erasure coding, was in mind with the fact that high density flash was coming at us.
Yeah.
So, to rebuild a disk very, very quickly, you don't want to always do network IOs. You want to be able to do it locally. And that's kind of the way that we're optimizing ARTESCA.
Yeah, good stuff. Hey, just talk a little bit about the partnership with service providers. Obviously, that interests me. I mean, I know that you guys do very well in the service provider space. I know that you've just released a VMware object storage extension for VMware Cloud Director as well. So you're really focusing on that area. So talk about how service providers are very important to you guys in terms of partnerships.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've always, as we talked about, historically had these relationships with the mega service providers, right? The Comcasts and the Charters of the world. Moreover, what's happening now is you're starting to see this mid-market of service providers, right? They want to serve a regional audience, or they want to serve a specific vertical audience. In Europe, what we're seeing is the service providers want to be a sovereign cloud. There's always been this concern about being too dependent on foreign technology. So they want to ensure that the data stays local, for example. That's the market we're serving. And they've been the ones demanding that we do more and more integration with vCloud Director. So vCloud now has an object storage extension that lets us be managed through the vCloud console.
Yeah.
You can actually provision the storage through that. We've done, all the different phases of work that it took to get there. But really the embrace that we're seeing now is in this kind of mid-market service provider that's building their own cloud services, usually for their specific B2B audience.
Yeah, good stuff. And again, offering a bit of flexibility in terms of the protocol, whether you go Ring, whether you go ARTESCA, that's big as well. In terms of other partnerships, so obviously you're broad, you've got use cases for the backup industry, and obviously broader than that, but just look, who are your key partners that you work with overall?
Yeah, so let me divide them into a couple of categories. On the platform side, we mentioned HPE, but they are not the only ones, right? We've partnered with Cisco for many years. They resell us on their UCS line of servers, Supermicro, Lenovo. There's a lot of hardware platform partners that we work with. On the cloud side, we've been very, very close with Microsoft Azure. We've done a lot of collaborative work with them, everything from object storage for Azure Stack to building a S3 to Azure Blob translator.
Okay, yeah.
So that's an ongoing relationship. And then on the ISV side, we've been really busy with the leading data protection vendors like Veeam, but also with Veritas and Commvault and Cohesity. In the analytics side, that's kind of the burgeoning one for us.
Yeah.
It took us a long time, but we've done all of the validation with Splunk now in multiple deployment models, by the way. This is single site, stretched, replicated. That was a lot of work to become validated. And we used to have some huge joint deployments with them. But there's also Cloudera, there's Micro Focus, there's a lot of other vendors in that space. Yeah. The last one I'll call out is the medical imaging community. This is an industry that generates tons of data.
Yep.
So think about all the picture archiving, PACS vendors and vendor neutral archives. They're very, they like the Ring because it can store petabytes of data for patient lifetime, right? So it's an ideal solution for them for that kind of data.
That's good. And I think that shows the broadness of the appeal that you guys have, which, so a lot of vendors will focus on particular verticals, but you guys have this broad appeal, which I think is part of your advantage, right?
Right.
Yeah. Let's talk about ransomware. I know it's a big thing, right? And you mentioned the partnership with Veeam, and obviously me being at Veeam, it'd be remiss of me to talk about,
of course,
the way that immutability and object storage, and the way that not only for backup, but only from a primary workload perspective, we are protecting against cyber crime and ransomware attacks, the sophistication of what's coming. How's Scality, dealing with that on the SDS side of it?
Yeah, so this has become a real focus area for us for now the last, year and a half to 2 years. We did a lot of early work in making sure that the systems were hardened, but it became clear to us that this whole area of ransomware protection behind a solution like Veeam is somewhere where we could really add value, right? So you have high-end customers that can fit with the Ring, but you have an entire mid-market of customers that can also use a solution like ARTESCA, right? So start with, 50 terabytes or 100 terabytes of data and then grow from there. That's not something the Ring could have done before. So we started hardening the product for this use case with things like object lock capabilities. So you get immutability, right? You can actually say lock the data for 60 days, 90 days, 6 months, whatever you want it to be. But we went further. We started adding retention policies. We added compliance mode. Once you set the locks, you can't override them, even if you're the super admin. So that, you're starting to think about the internal malicious threat that may come about.
Very important, that overlooked almost.
Very important, yeah. But more than that, you can harden the operating system. You can make it possible to not log into the root, right? You can lock down network ports. You can slim down the OS so you don't have as many CVEs in the packages, right? There's so much work you can do here. Multi-factor authentication, encryption of the data, right? So all of that is in all the products right now, and it's something that we've worked very closely with many vendors, but I would really say Veeam the most. We were one of the inaugural launch partners for Veeam V12, so we started testing it last year. So we support direct-to-object storage, we support the SOS API, and now we've gone further, right? We've actually made simplified installers for Veeam. We've done security policies for Veeam, and we started performance tuning for Veeam.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the future in terms of what we've been talking about at the company, which is really focusing on object storage as a primary workload, not only for that those landing zone type of backup, but also through a life cycle of capacity and archives. So that's cool that you guys are doing that with us. And we can't talk about it today because this episode is going live before VeeamON 2023, but there are going to be some really good announcements there as well at the show. So looking forward to that.
That's right.
Just to finish off, I've got a couple of minutes left. Just wanted to ask you about how are you guys going to continue to innovate and disrupt the market moving forward in a market where I feel like storage has become, kind of like table stakes. However, it's still very important for a lot of people. But platforms like Kubernetes and, we're talking about WASM coming into play have kind of taken the storage focus away. So how do you guys remain, there or thereabouts in this sort of new world over the next 4 or 5 years?
Yeah, I think we look at, we look at a lot of different ways, right? But moreover, the customer's voice. And the customer does have a long-term view about how they want to use their data, right? You can't say that the storage is strategic, although it's the data that's strategic, right?
Absolutely.
So what do we hear? We hear 3 themes, okay? Number 1 is data is going outside of the traditional data center, going to the edge, right? And if you think about a lightweight object store, it's very ideal for edge deployments, right? It can run on a VM, it can run on Kubernetes. That's really perfect, right? And we're starting to see this pattern of hundreds or thousands of edge locations that collect data, but need to return some amount of that data back to a central data center, right? So you can see an ARTESCA to RING combination in that, okay? So that's one pattern. Making management of these big federated systems easier is one of our strategic directions. So that's something we're working on very actively. The second one is lifecycle management of the data from hot to cold, right? Yeah. Data comes in, it's hot. Where do you want to put it? You want to put it on a flash, right? You might want to retire it at some point to a more cost-effective high-density flash, like a QLC. Over time, maybe it makes sense to put it on spinners, right? But it goes further. You've also got cloud storage, you've got cold storage in the cloud, and you've still got banks that are running on tape, right? So this idea of single S3 endpoint that manages your data across these different temperatures and locations is something that you can innovate in. So that's another thrust for us. I'll throw one more out at the risk of overloading things. You're storing billions of files. What good is it if you can't find the data, right? So some blending of intelligent search query with data storage, right, makes a lot of sense going forward.
Amazing. Well, look, the future's bright for you guys. I really love what you guys are doing. Again, you're mature, you're set. You've got a great reputation in the market, and looking forward to what Scality are going to do over the next 5 to 7 years as we get into 2030, as scary as that is again. Hey, Paul, thanks for being on the show. Just as a final reminder, if you would like to be on the show, please go to GTwGT podcast. You can find me at Anthony Spiteri or go to GTwGT.com. And with that, I'd like to thank Paul and Scality for being on episode 64 of Great Things with Great Tech.